Okay. So when Daniel reached out and said, "Could you give a presentation?" That seems like many thousands of years ago now, because the landscape for transgender care has changed so radically and continues to change that what even when I prepared these slides a few weeks ago, the landscape now is has changed yet again. And so some of the things I'm going to say, I'm going to have to do a bit of a catch up just to sort of catch where we are now and maybe talk about where we're going. I will start off, however, by giving a land acknowledgement, because diversity, equity, and inclusion are not illegal in Canada at this point, because we're not the 51st state. Um, and so, as a member of the University of Calgary in Western Canada, and maybe some people have visited us and you know where it is, I acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, who include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations, and also acknowledge that the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. And that's the medicine wheel there, which hopefully will put some good spirit into the presentation today. I'm a professional. I try to be a professional. So let me talk about my conflicts of interest. As Rena, noted, I am the EIC for Advances, and I get a very small amount of money from Spring for that. I don't think that constitutes a conflict of interest. At no point have people pushed envelopes full of, unused or you banknotes under my hotel room door or anything like that. So although I don't feel that I'm mostly not evil, it's a bit of a shame because it would be nice if the opportunity had even presented itself. I would also note that I'm a PhD medical education scholar. I'm a sociologist. I'm not an MD, and so the things I'll be talking about, if you want me to talk about the healthcare side of things, I'm probably going to push it back to you because you probably know more about the healthcare side of this than I do. What I'm going to talk about today is the issues around medical education and the broader issues, particularly drawing in concepts of professional resistance towards the end of this presentation. Um, so a bit of background. And terminology is going to trip me up and it's going to trip you up, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk about, is that terminology is really hard in this space because there is no one set of terms that will then encompass everybody, because it's like the elusive bar of soap in the bath. However you try to grab a hold of it, it'll shoot out of your hand, and there's always more. It's always stranger. That said, trans, however you define that, people have been recorded since earliest times. And yet, the acknowledgement of that, particularly in Western Christian society, has been very lacking. And really, it's only in the last 50 years or so that real medical attention has been paid to this. And a lot of that's in regard to some, fairly large, high publicity cases like Christian Jorgensen after the Second World War, those kind of things, such that the concept of the sex change as a term was only coined in the 1950s, even though some of the original pioneering surgery done in Germany had actually happened in the 1920s and 1930s. And by the way, if you've ever seen the video of Nazis burning books, it's quite a famous video, and they're all walking around and throwing books onto a big pile. It's fun. It's actually it's Hirschfeld's library at the Institute, and Hirschfeld was really the pioneer of transgender care. And if you've ever seen the movie The Danish Girl, that's the representation, is it's Hirschfeld. So when you see the burning of books, it's actually books about transgender, about queer culture, about queer medicine generally. And hopefully we're not going to see that again. But the term transsexual was termed in the 1960s, and transgender was termed in the 1970s. So, it's not, although there is a long cultural history for trans people, the medical history is actually relatively recent. And it has been, to some extent, like medicine's been catching up. Certainly, there's been a long and complicated history of trans people interacting with the healthcare system. Physicians, all of you, are embedded in your various cultures, and hopefully, to an extent, those are professional cultures with, a more rigorous and a broader sense of humanity and compassion. But nevertheless, there is a history of the biases of society being visited in the consulting rooms and the various places where healthcare is provided, and to the point where trans people, many have a hard time trusting healthcare providers. And that has not been helped by a high degree of pathologization. Trans is an illness. It's a sickness. It's something that we need to cure or we need to lock people up for. And that was the case even in the introduction of some of the earliest guidelines. It was figured as an illness, as a disease. And this is included providing care to trans people for non-trans related issues. There's the apocryphal story of the trans broken arm. Trans patient presents with a broken arm and gets a very different range of treatment for a broken arm because they're trans. And the only thing wrong with them is they have a broken arm, which does not really make a difference. What your gender identity expression or your sexuality or anything else is. Your broken arm is your broken arm. And so there are some significant issues in around medicine. Let's say that medicine has a complicated history with transgender people. Now, really, we've only been paying attention to this in the context of medical education within the last 10 years or so. And mostly because of grassroots activity, not because people have come to some beneficent, deans and, people in leading positions, the AAMC or whoever, just gone, we should really be better people than we are. We should follow the better angels of our nature. No, it's actually been grassroots saying, hold on, you need to be paying more attention to this. So it's not in accreditation. It's not coming from the top. It's coming from the bottom. Um, and even then, because it is a grassroots activity and there's not been really strong guidance, it's not really in the curriculum, it's not in the MCCQA, it's not in any of the professional licensing exams, at least as far as I know. Then it's been rather random how people have gone about presenting and teaching and orienting students and then trainees to be able to provide, let's say, adequate, let alone good trans healthcare. And this is really where my group came in, and I'm speaking on behalf of a broader group. So I was the education scientist in this group, but this was actually a student-led activity in Calgary. Now, we weren't the only people to be concerned about this. So Oberdin Malava and et al., now 14 years ago, noted that more than a third of American schools had no LGBTQ. That's not just the T, but any of the increasingly long sort of acronym that goes with that, none whatsoever. And those that did tended to ignore trans. They'll go for intersex, but they wouldn't do trans. They would do LGB, and somehow the T and the Q plus actually sort of fell off the end. And again, more recently, nearly a decade later, Nolan et al. Still said this is still happening, and particularly trans is missing. And they said that a clear best practice for transgender curricular development has not yet been identified in the literature. And that looks like a throwdown. That's a challenge. So we should do something about that. And we did. And so a group of students, undergraduate students, organized a trans teaching session in 2018. And it didn't go very well because they didn't know what they were doing. And bless them, I mean, I think a lot of this is on the faculty who kind of left it to the students to fix this. And we see this in so many social issues. I don't know whether you have a student-run clinic or some variations of that in New York, but same kind of issues. The most pressing healthcare is somehow left to the least able to actually provide it, not because students are, they're lacking, because they often have the greater moral agency and the greater moral authority, frankly, but it's these individuals who actually ended up doing this work, which they were not very well prepared to do. And so there was this challenge from this session, and particularly Nicole Thompson, who was an undergraduate student at the time, was leading this group of students who came to me and said we should do something about this. We struggled a little bit with what terminologies we should use, and we settled on transgender and gender diverse, not because everybody would agree on it, because everybody disagreed the least on this one. So this is the one that pissed people off the least, rather than it's the one that everybody thought was the best. Because there is no term however big you spread the umbrella, there are always people outside it. So, this will do. This is a working concept, and it's more, and this is true when you're working with any equity deserving group, is the sense of we're doing what we can. We acknowledge we're flawed, but we're stepping into this space with you. Can you meet us halfway? And on this basis, the trans community in Calgary did. Um, and there were trans members of the community involved in the planning for this, as well as physicians who provide trans care, and many physicians who don't, some of who were internists. We had uh, family doctors, all sorts of people involved. And what we wanted to do was come up with a series of guidelines and practices that we could recommend education programs, at least in a Western orientation, because we also acknowledge that their trans has interesting reconstructions in different cultures. It's very different in Thailand. It's very different in African cultures. It's very different in North American indigenous cultures. I'm not sure how much of that is part of your world in New York, but certainly indigenous peoples are a significant part of our conversation in Canada, and they have the concept of two-spirit people, which is not quite the same as trans. It's intrinsically an indigenous construct. So we were aware that although we were going to come up with guidelines, they weren't necessarily going to be worldwide, but they would at least apply, we'd hoped, in North America, and mostly in Anglophone and mostly in high-income countries where there's some degree of commonality, or at least maybe there used to be. Maybe that's not there anymore. But the key thing we decided to do was to use a Delphi method, and Delphi is about drawing consensus. And so what you do is you go through rounds where you ask questions to an expert panel, defined however you want, and they will rate or rank or sort or work out various propositions so that you end up with a community consensus, at least from your panel, about what's the most important things and what's the least important things. And not only are the things that are there, but also they can suggest items and things that are missing or how they should be reworded. So this is what we decided to do. And more specifically, we went through 3 to 4, we actually went through 4 rounds in the end, and including discussions within our study team. And there were 10 people involved in the study team, so it was quite a large group to do that. When we came up with our provisional recommendations, we took it to the community members. And this wasn't just locally in Calgary. We had some really great trans people as part of the study team who were part of national, actually international networks. So they were respondents from the States and a few from Europe, as well as mostly Canadian, but it was nationwide. And on the basis of that, we reworked and we had another consensus, another consultation, and then we got to a series of recommendations that came out of this study. So in the end, we had 71 panel members and 56 community members who responded to this. So the numbers are pretty good for Adelphi, because often they're actually half or even less than that. We ended up with 48 recommendations, which is quite a lot. And one of the subtexts I'm going to talk about today is, boy, oh boy, there's a lot of stuff here. How can possibly you fit this into undergraduate medical education curricula? Because I'm sure, as if any of you are involved in UME, and I'm sure a lot of you are, you realize it's so dense, it's almost like a neutron star. And if you put one more thing in it, it will just collapse into a black hole and nobody will ever be seen again. And so the best you can do is, if you want to put something in, you have to take something out. It's like whack-a-mole. You put bang something in, something else flies out. So the key thing is, we acknowledge that there were a lot of recommendations, and that's is something I'll talk to. We group them around core values, core teaching objectives, and guidance on how the teaching should happen. And now I'm going to walk you through some of them. I'm not just going to read them to you. I'll discuss what they look like and what some of the implications are for some of them. Oh, sorry. And this is all published in a paper in Perspectives in Medical Education. It's an open source journal. We specifically targeted this journal so that there would be no paywall. Everybody in the world can access this and do something with it if they wish. And that, by the way, that's the 10 core members of the team. So Nicole, Claire, Danielle, Helena, Theodore. It's actually Ted, but I like to call him Theodore because it annoys him. James, Fiona, Joe, Andrea, and Rabia. And great team. We did some fantastic work. So what were our recommendations? Well, that TGD training at the UME level. So we didn't go into PGME, because once you're into specialties, then you have a very different kind of perspective. What a family doc may see, it may be different from a pediatrician, but actually maybe not so very different, but very different from an endocrinologist or a surgeon or a plastic surgeon, and so on and so on. So they're very different kinds of perspectives. So this is just UME level. The training should be focused on primary care, although it should be applicable to all specialties. So basically, we if we were getting into surgery, into endocrinology, if we're getting into some of the into the psychiatry side, so these things, then we wouldn't be at 49, we'd be at 149. And so primary care was the focus. It was had to be about relationship building, acknowledging the long history of inadvertent or sometimes deliberate bad practice from the medical profession. We had to emphasize patient advocacy and communication, not just the technocratic side of medicine. Here's a service, or I will do something to, for, or with you, but we have to build that relationship. It should be inclusive of all trans, non-binary, and gender diverse identities and presentations. And there, I think if you had for however many human beings you have, at that n, there'll be n plus X number of presentations. And those presentations, a lot of them are not stable, that individuals will re-identify. New terminology comes along like genderqueer or things like that. People go, oh yeah, okay. And then maybe another term comes along and they go, actually, that's more me. And people's identities can be somewhat fluid in this space. And so it has to be inclusive. It should be mandatory. This is not something that people should be able to opt out of any more than you can opt out of. Well, I'm not going to treat women, or I'm not going to treat people with a learning disability, or I'm not going to treat ginger people, or no, you don't get to do that. The human beings get the right to have people who are caring for them to actually be competent to do so, and that the training should include TGD people. It's not just as in, well, and again, in that rather patrician colonial way that, the people who know best will do it on your behalf. No, this has to be with, not to. Students need to be aware that discussing TGD status can be very sensitive, and this has clearly got even more complicated in your country in the last few weeks, where discussing somebody's status, particularly if it's not apparent or they themselves are not out forthcoming with their own identity, then you have to be careful who hears this, how these things are disclosed. Curiosity is a major problem that and this very much came from the TG community, is that they were very tired and wary of physicians who just were curious. And you might think, well, what's wrong with curiosity? It's basis of science. Why wouldn't do that? Yeah, but it is speculative, and it is really invasive to individuals who are carrying, most of whom are carrying some kind of trauma. And therefore, particularly for, physicians, even if they feel that they're doing it in the best possible way, can often destroy or certainly harm the relationship with their patients if their speculation or curiosity exceeds what is required to be able to provide care. They need to understand that they need to respect the physical boundaries of TG patients. Again, there wasn't really a conversation at this point about trauma-informed care or trauma-informed learning, although actually there are a lot of parallels here. A lot of people who are trans-identifying carry trauma, and it's not just, here's a person and they would like some healthcare, please, but here's a person who already is injured, and you can't necessarily see that. And so, people who are carrying traumatic injury, if they have particularly complex PTSD, that's the one that builds over time rather than, the classic PTSD, which is described in the DSM, is about single events, mass killings, military action, something like that. Complex PTSD is acquired. And so these are people, it's often acquired by people who've been subject to childhood sexual assault and things like that. It's something that grows over time. And on that basis, things like physical boundaries are really important. And that they need to understand that transgender isn't just one thing, but it's a complex, wibbly wobbly set of definitions that people move in and out of. Um, there's a thing called WPATH, so the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and I can't remember if it's actually part of the World Health Organization or not. But either way, there is an international organization, and it does set the standards that pretty much every nation, most nations, I'm not sure what happens in Russia or China, but most nations do subscribe to this. Or and I don't know now whether your nation subscribes to this anymore because you left the World Health Organization, bless you. But there is a set of standards. There is an organization that meets regularly to revise and come up with new standards. They provide a set of clinical guidelines, which include things like, well, the age at which you should be able to below which you should not actually be able to prescribe things like puberty blockers or engage in hormone replacement therapy or engage in surgical procedures. And interesting, a lot of the legislation, certainly in my province here in Canada, Alberta, the government here decided it was important to pass a law to say, well, you can't provide surgical care for people under 18 and you can't provide HRT for people under 16. Well, that's actually what the World WPATH says already. So you spent 3 days passing a law you didn't need to pass because it's already part of the clinical guidelines. So bless you there. Um, there are lots of complex issues around, particularly around sex and gender, separating the two, that terminology is important, that pronouns are important, and preferred patient names, and that the students should develop some level of safety in being able to explore this. And again, it's that appreciative inquiry, that sense of, well, we're probably not going to get it right, but we're going to do our best and try and make it as safe as for everyone, not just safe for the TG participants, but safe for the learners. Otherwise, they start building resentment. They start thinking, well, this is too hard, or the burden is always on me. I'm always the bad person here. You can't get into that space because then you kind of just hollow out the opportunity this provides. Students need to know about sources of trauma. And understand how that, particularly the way that relates to the medical system. They need to appreciate the challenges that trans patients can face in accessing healthcare. Just being able to have the confidence to walk into a healthcare space if they have previously had negative experiences. They need to understand the nature of social disadvantage. If again, I'm not sure how many of you spend time in this space or know about it, but the burden of violence on trans people is disproportionately on individuals of color. So if it's not just that people of African American descent or so on have generally worse outcomes and negative experience. They're particularly bad around trans people. The number of murders of trans-identified African Americans in America is quite horrific, and it continues. In fact, it's probably getting worse at the moment. Um, and you need to understand the social determinants of health more generally about education, class, health, stability in a family, those kinds of things. Students need to know about social community supports available to people. The fact that there may actually be other concurrent mental health disorders and even degrees of suicidality, and the level of suicidality for trans patients is at least 1 to 2 orders of magnitude larger than the general population. Um, the previous medical trauma may impact the care they're able to provide them and may limit the amount that they're able to provide care. They need to differentiate the different kinds of effects of dysphoria on the mental health and the mental health from other concerns. There's certainly some studies that have looked at, for instance, at concurrent issues around spectrum, about autism and trans identifying individuals and so on. It's not conclusive. But if there are some interesting issues, and actually has been picked up by anti-trans protesters that when all trans people are mentally ill anyway, so that's a good excuse not to even give them the time of day. Trans people need to know about how physicians' opinions and the way they communicate can actually change the relationship. And they need to know some very basic sort of medical things along, the criteria for hormone therapy, the physical effects thereof, the risks and side effects that you need to, you need to be able to get people into giving informed consent, and the person actually driving that needs to know enough to be informed themselves so they can inform others. And also the risk of withholding for hormone therapy. It's not just the risk of doing it, but also the risk of not doing it. They need to know about some of the post-transition related surgical anatomy. Now, not all trans people go through surgery, and no means all, partly because of cost, partly because of availability of surgeons, and partly because of choice. And that doesn't invalidate a trans individual's identity because of their surgical choices. Um, need to know about things like sexual health, contraception. They need to understand the barriers that individuals face there, particularly trans men who elect to retain their wombs and may even bear children, and the difficulties those individuals have going through the medical system. And I suppose you could do it outside the medical system, not very safe. And the role that healthcare providers can actually have in making sure that care is safe. Students should demonstrate basic knowledge of the role of the family physician. They need to understand not just about the going up to and the point of transition and shortly thereafter, but also the whole life cycle up into aging patients. They need to understand how they manage things like routine procedures, particularly around things like cancer screening and those kind of things, which can be traumatic. And certainly they can certainly alienate and lead individuals to not engage with the healthcare system, which leads to higher rates of undiagnosed cancer and other conditions along those ways. You need to know how to take a good inclusive history and how to conduct an appropriate physical exam. And I should say, I have significantly played down and limited the recommendations. I would recommend you read the paper, which actually lists them in full to get the full spectrum, including all the some of the qualifying clauses in some of those things about the way these should be done. We did recommend that teachers should be physicians or allied health professionals with direct knowledge of gender affirming primary care, and it should also involve TGD people. Often it may be that these are the first time that many of our learners, many of your learners may have met, encountered, interacted, even sat in a room with a trans person, or rather, at least that's the first time they're aware that they have done so, which is more to the point. Um, and that there should be that the time allocated, this should be balanced. It's not that we have to again shove everything else out of the way because this group of people are really, really important. It's like, when you've got a rope line going into a club, you don't just move them to the front so everybody else gets a problem. This has to be balanced in the curriculum. So these were our recommendations, and we made them. We thought they were very reasonable. And actually, the community members thought so too. And I'm not going to read all these out, but the key thing is that we one of the reasons we had confidence making these recommendations because they were so favorably responded to by members of the community who saw in them at least an attempt to try not to just make sure that their medical, clinical, healthcare needs were being addressed, but some of the past harms, the trauma, the injustice that was to an extent that was to be found in the medical system was actually also being considered, and this was essentially repairing and not just providing care in the way that these individuals experienced it. Um, the strengths and weaknesses of this study, well, there's a lot. Actually, 49 recommendations is a lot. Where are you going to fit all these things in? And what if every other equity deserving group also came forward with the same number of provisions? Again, we're back to the whack-a-mole neutron star thing. How much can a UME curriculum reasonably undertake? And that's down really to each individual program. And I think it really needs also a conversation in the community. And oddly, the community doesn't seem to want to, medical education community, that is, does not really seem to want to talk about this. There seem to be a lot of people who go and kind of start getting a bit twitchy when you want to talk about these things, which really suggests that, the maturity and the professionalism as regards providing care for trans people is still lacking in the med ed community as much as it is in the general medical community as a whole. Um, we've also found that there is learner resistance to doing this kind of work. Some because they do hold an ideological antipathy. They say, well, I'm a religious person. It says, in the Bible, one man, one woman can't change. They don't talk about, you've got to stone a woman who sits on your couch while she's menstruating. But, they can usually select which bits they go with. But there are also some who are confused or uncomfortable. And that's the whole point of safety is that they're not against it. They come from a background where they just don't know, and they don't know. And there are those who resist because they don't think it goes far enough. They want more of this. They say, well, where was this? And why are you stopping here? Why don't you talk about this? And so there, it's not that you just do this and then the students passively kind of go, yes, thank you very much. Now I have the wisdom of all these things. Well, like the Matrix, you stick the cable in the back of their neck, and now they have all the wisdom that they need. If only medical education would probably take about 5 minutes. Maybe we could just come up with a pill, and so admissions takes about 10 times longer than the education itself. That notwithstanding, it is a complicated landscape. And so implementing this is not just, well, just do what we said and everything will be fine. There's still a lot more to it than this because of the complex and somewhat squeamish nature of social mores around trans people, at least in most Western white Christian oriented cultures and in some other cultures as well. But the key thing is that this is difficult in our culture because there is such a long history of problems. But those problems have not actually stopped. There has been a rapid growing hostility to anything trans related. I'm sure, unless you have been really living under a rock for the last, certainly since November and really since, I don't know, 2010, then you would have noticed that somehow trans is an issue. Um, and, under the current administration, in the same way as the administration before the previous administration, trans people are being erased from society, and not just from a cultural sense, but legally, and through government policy. And so you have not just states, but now your federal government is getting into moving towards banning name changes. It's banned having an X gender marker on your passports. Things like use of access to toilets and changing rooms, participation in sports and the military has been a major issue. Essentially, trans people are systematically being erased from society and they're expected to crawl under a rock or just to cease existing or to go back to the natural way that they were supposed to be when they were born. To the point where gender theory, in the same way as woke or any of these other concepts, which originally had a fairly beneficent start, but have been significantly weaponized into something deeply negative. There are these toxic social media issues, that X and all these other platforms. And this is before Elon bought the company. He was anti-trans way before, and he's got a trans daughter. J.K. Rowling, I'm not sure how much of this you've seen, but the author of the Harry Potter stories is fervently anti-trans, and many, many, many others, to the point where trans people don't engage in social media anymore. What's the point? It's just toxic. There are rapidly growing levels of violence, including up to murders. Trans care is being banned in the same way as reproductive care, and particularly abortion and IVF and other things are being banned in some states, to the point where physicians can actually be imprisoned for providing care. This is now including significantly for trans care as well. And this is a US problem in the sense of a lot of it's coming out of your country, but it's in my country too, and it's in the UK, and it's in through most of Europe, and it's a disease the whole world has got. And so what looked like a world that was starting to be kinder, to be a bit more compassionate, and at least trying to understand trans people 10, 20 years ago has done a 180 on this and is driving the other way, to the point you may, well, do trans people even exist, or is this just something local? It's a trend or a craze. So yes, trans people exist, and no, it's not a trend or a craze, but it's a political way to actually erase those individuals. Now, that how many trans people are depends on how you define trans and how people self-identify as well. So it's actually very hard to say this many people. Although very approximately, again, depending on which definitions and self-identifications you use, about 0.5% of the population identify or present as trans, and which is compared, for instance, to about 3 to 4% of queer people in general. And so it's even a small subset, it's like with 99.5% of people don't identify this way, but it's actually way more than a lot of, fairly rare diseases and, neurodegenerative diseases and some genetic complications, which people sink millions of dollars into because you don't want to see little sad babies, but trans people somehow aren't worth the care anymore. And there is a very large spectrum. And so you might say, well, okay, well, how do we back this up? Where's the science? Well, the science is actually there. This is a lovely infographic that was published in Scientific American about, I don't know, 5, 10 years ago, 2017 maybe. And on that basis, here's one graphic, and it's just an infographic, so it's clearly a simplification of the spread of genetic and endocrinological and physical variations of gender in the human. This isn't, fish and crocodiles and things. These are human beings. And so, you've got on one side, you've got this sense of, what they call typical biological female, which is just a statistical construct. but all these different variations, and not just the sense of there's lots of variation, like different genetic anomalies, but also the way that they can contribute to other conditions and other presentations. And so there are pathways about the variations, and intersex kind of falls in the middle of this, and this is the male end of it. But the key thing is that human beings, like any other species on this planet, have a complex gender presentation. And just because, there is a sort of two large groups, one at either end, large gametes and small gametes, doesn't mean there's not a lot of complication in between. And if you reduce that only the ones at the far end of the spectrum are actually legitimate and just basically scoop out the middle and say, you don't even exist anymore. That's an erasure of human beings, of identity, of possibility. This is a fundamental ontological and epistemic act of injustice, and something we have to really think about. And science, unfortunately, has contributed to this problem. So a lot of the research has been conducted in this space, particularly less recently, although some of it's still happening, has been poorly executed. It has included lots of the biases of the researchers to the point where it actually increases disadvantage and social control rather than reducing it. In fact, there is a litany of science in this space as a whole. So not just trans people, but for queer people as across the spectrum as a whole. I mean, conversion therapies are still an issue, and conversion therapies have been banned in some places, but they're still allowed, I think, in the majority of the states in your union, and they're still allowed in provinces, some provinces in my country too. There's a long history of violence against trans and intersex children. There's John Money's experiments on intersex kids that I would just point you to them, but it's quite hideous. And maybe he was doing it for the best possible reasons, but it came up with some of the worst possible, including, suicidality in adults and so on. The medicalization of LGBT, in the DSM, this has long been. In fact, I think homosexuality came out of DSM, I think in version 3. Trans is still in there as a pathology. And one of the reasons it's still in there, not because and it has been lobbied for individuals, not because it is a pathology, because that's the only way you get insurance. So it has to be named as a pathology, so you actually can get the medical care that you need. If it's not a pathology, then the insurance won't pay for it. Um, there are concepts like autogynephilia that Blanchard came up with, and this is the concept that male to female trans-identified individuals just do it because of the sexual kick. It's because they get off on thinking about themselves as women, and it's a hideous theory. There's things like the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria. This is the idea that teenage girls who feel that it's very difficult to be a woman in the modern age, it is, are now just wanting to be boys, and it's this craze, like it's about being a Swiftie or something like that. Well, no, the evidence doesn't back that up either. In fact, there's all these other things out there that actually have been a major problem, and science has actually put the problems in the place. That this didn't come from the trans community; it came from the scientific community. Physicians do this too, and they also contribute to policy. And an example of this is the CAS report from last year in the UK, which was led by a physician and had mostly physicians on the committee, which basically has stalled trans care in the United Kingdom. And they have said things like, well, the science to back up gender blockers and HRT is so poor that we shouldn't do it at all. Well, on that basis, then we should start doing about half of all medicine because the evidence for a lot of what we do isn't that strong either. And puberty blockers are still being given to kids who have early onset puberty, but they're not being given to trans kids. And so here we have, some real double standards, some real hypocrisy in the House of Medicine, that the same drug to basically, if the same child presents in one way or presents another way, they actually get different kinds of care. And so we have all sorts of issues that are coming from medicine as well as from science. And this is despite the science knows that actually human beings and every other organism on Earth is queer as hell, that we have lots and lots of variations. Here's this wonderful book called Biological Exuberance by Bargamel, published by Stonewall, bless them, and which is basically a large treatise on the varieties of gender and sexuality presentations in all sorts of species. And yet we have this in, well, humans, we seem to have this weaponization of natural and, trying to use the Bible or some other thing as a justification for this, so that you can only have male, female dyads to do anything. And things like male, female binaries are the only acceptable way, and so on and so on and so on, despite the fact that science says otherwise. So why is trans an issue different from other LGBTQ? Well, because other than maybe PrEP and things like that, queer people, particularly promiscuous homosexual men, don't really need healthcare. Specifically, lesbians, on the whole, don't need the healthcare system other than just for routine care. But trans people do. At least some trans people do. They seek to medically transition. So the medical world is pulled in. In fact, because a lot of trans people's need is so great that the medical world can actually manipulate, and unfortunately has a history of manipulating individuals on this basis. Not all, I'm sure there are many who are very kind and compassionate, but there is a history in here. So there are all these issues about inequalities and double standards that again create this landscape where trans people have a long mistrusted medicine, and rather than medicine being in a position to actually withdraw to address this, and the fact that you're having this presentation today, I'm hoping is that in your institution and your professional careers that you have a commitment to humanity, which includes trans people. Not necessarily, to the exclusion of anybody else, but the tent is big enough that we can accept that trans people are human beings and provide the care that they need. And it is a broad focus. It can be inclusive of so many things. It's not just a youth thing, although people mostly become visible at the point they transition, but then often disappear thereafter. Um, so a lot of the conversation, a lot of the hysteria, a lot of the social media is on youth and younger people, but it's not the reality. And so there is the issue that even in the healthcare system, a lot of people overlook this. So try and draw this together to some kind of conclusions or some kind of starting point for a conversation. There is a standing problem that physicians are not being trained. They are ill prepared to provide patient care, both standard care as well as trans-related care to these patients. There's been almost nothing in medical education for the longest time about this, although we were turning the corner on this, and in places where it is not such a contentious issue, it continues to be developed. I don't know how this plays out in your country now, or how it's going to play out over the next 4 years, or beyond that. And maybe the state by state difference is going to become even more acute, and you're going to have things like sanctuary cities and all those other things that we're starting to see. And I think New York is a sanctuary city. Right, okay, thank you. So bless you for that. So there are issues about how do you provide this. We conducted a study, we came up with recommendations. How many of these recommendations will find their way into practice is unclear, but we've set at least a recommended standard around which other people can develop their programming as best fits their particular context. And you have to really ask that if you don't do this, are physicians prepared to look after this part of the community? And the evidence shows no, they are radically not. However, there's the broader issue that of the aggression, the societal aggression against trans people, to the point where it is becoming desperately anti-science, like regulating that pi should just equal 3. And if you think that's kind of a bit funny, well, I can tell you that your state of Indiana did actually pass legislation that pi should only equal 3 because 3.1418 is just too difficult. Okay, it was 100 years ago, but they did do it. And so, if medicine is based on science, and it is, and the society and the government that you're working under is becoming anti-science, then there's a much, much larger issue about the nature of medical practice and medical identity, that people still expect you to provide care, but they don't no longer believe in, trust, or support the basic principles and philosophy where that care comes from, and the basis of the opinions and the judgment that comes from. And we saw this in COVID. We had in Calgary anti-vaccine protesters blocking access to the emergency room so that patients couldn't get the care they needed, whether or not they were presenting with COVID or anything. And the irrationality of this becomes deeply problematic, and something that you all have to deal with, not just in the context of trans, although that may be one of the apex points where it becomes most acute, but in so many other areas as well. And so you have to really think about what it means, not just, well, how do we operationalize this within our UME program, but how much does this actually reflect your identities and your moral agency as physicians and caregivers in a world that somehow has lost its trust in science and rationality and is moving in a different direction? I don't have an answer for you for that, but this isn't a critically important time in your profession and the point where you need to think what it means to be a responsible physician and what it means for you and all your colleagues and your trainees and your peers to actually hold on to what medicine matters about compassion and care and logic and reason and evidence and truth. And so I started by talking about a trans curriculum in the UME program, and I've ended in a much more political and possibly, I don't think, darker space because I have faith in the House of Medicine. But that means all of you need to stand up and be part of this. And with that, let us turn it over to some questions if we have time.
Thank you